In April 2024, the Grayson family stood on the brink of collapse in the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. A devastating revelation had surfaced. Pastor David Grayson, a man revered by his congregation at Grace Life Church, had been unfaithful to his wife, Sarah. What followed was a deeply painful journey that tested the very foundations of their faith and marriage. Months earlier, in February 2024, a seemingly ordinary day at the Grayson home became the starting point of a series of events that would unravel their lives, leaving heartbreak, betrayal, and redemption in its wake. March 3, 2024. The sanctuary of Grace Life Church was packed that Sunday morning. The soft sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant colors onto the polished wooden pews. David stood at the pulpit, Bible in hand. His voice calm, but commanding, as he spoke about the sanctity of marriage. His words echoed with conviction, his tone unwavering. "Marriage is a sacred covenant," David proclaimed, his eyes scanning the congregation. "It's a reflection of God's unchanging love for his people. A bond built on trust, sacrifice, and grace." The congregation erupted into applause as David closed his sermon with a heartfelt prayer. Members of the church whispered to one another about how blessed they were to have such a devoted and wise pastor leading them. In the front row, Sarah smiled politely, but something about David's demeanor struck her as odd. He was usually calm and steady, but today he seemed almost too animated. His voice carried an urgency that felt out of place. And then there was the glance. A fleeting look toward the secretary seated just a few rows behind Sarah. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Sarah noticed. She couldn't quite place why it made her stomach churn. Perhaps it was the way the secretary, a young woman named Melissa, seemed unusually attentive, nodding and smiling at every word David spoke. As the congregation filed out, David stood at the doors, shaking hands and offering kind words. Sarah lingered nearby, observing his interactions. Melissa approached him last, her bright red dress standing out against the sea of muted tones. "You did a wonderful job today, Pastor," Melissa said, her voice lilting. David smiled, but Sarah caught the faintest flicker of something in his expression. Nervousness, perhaps? He quickly thanked Melissa and turned his attention to the next person, but the unease in Sarah's chest lingered long after they'd driven home. March 8th. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind Sarah usually cherished. With David at the church preparing for Sunday's service and their 2 children at school, she decided to tidy up his study. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and coffee, a space that felt warm and familiar. As Sarah dusted the bookshelves, her hand accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on David's desk. She knelt to pick them up when something unusual caught her eye. An open laptop with an email notification blinking in the corner of the screen. At first, she hesitated. David valued his privacy, and she trusted him. But something urged her to look closer. The subject line read, "Can't stop thinking about you." Her heart raced as she clicked on the email. What she read made her stomach turn. It was from Melissa. The message was flirtatious, filled with words that spoke of longing and intimacy. And worse, David had replied. Sarah's hands trembled as she scrolled through their exchange. The emails revealed a relationship that went beyond innocent words. Late-night meetings, private conversations, and a tone of familiarity that felt like a knife to her chest. Tears blurred her vision as she closed the laptop. The room, once a place of comfort, now felt suffocating. She sank into the chair, gripping the edge of the desk to steady herself. By the time David came home that evening, Sarah was waiting for him in the living room. The laptop sat on the coffee table like a silent witness. "David," she began, her voice shaking. "What is this?" David froze. His eyes darted to the laptop, then back to Sarah. "It's not what you think," he stammered, stepping closer. "Not what I think." Sarah's voice rose. "Then explain the emails, David. Explain why Melissa thinks she can talk to you this way. Explain why you responded." David's defenses crumbled under Sarah's fury. He tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was undeniable. Finally, he sank into the chair opposite her, his face buried in his hands. "I messed up, Sarah," he whispered. "I let things get too far. I never meant to hurt you." Sarah's chest heaved with anger and pain. "Do you even realize what you've done? To me? To this family? To your ministry?" Their voices echoed through the house as the argument escalated, accusations and tears filling the spaces that once held laughter and love. By the end of the night, David was left sobbing on the couch while Sarah retreated to their bedroom, slamming the door behind her. March 10th. The next morning, Sarah woke to a house that felt hollow. David had left early for the church, leaving behind a hastily scribbled note. "I'm sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." But Sarah wasn't ready to hear apologies. She spent the day avoiding calls from concerned friends and dodging questions from their children. By the afternoon, she made the decision to step back from her church responsibilities. She couldn't face the congregation, knowing what she knew. At church, David carried on as if nothing had happened. He stood at the pulpit, delivering a sermon on grace and redemption, his voice steady but his eyes weary. Some of the congregation noticed his strained expression, whispering among themselves during the service. "Is everything all right with Pastor David?" One woman asked her friend. "I'm not sure," came the reply. "Sarah hasn't been around much lately. Maybe she's sick." The rumors began to spread, each one cutting Sarah deeper. She spent her days holed up in their bedroom, rereading the emails and replaying the argument in her mind. How had they come to this? Meanwhile, David threw himself into his work, masking his guilt with a facade of determination. He prayed fervently for forgiveness, but the weight of his actions was heavy. Each time he stepped onto the stage, he felt like a fraud, preaching about the very values he had betrayed. This chapter of their story was one of pain and confrontation, the first crack in a seemingly unshakable foundation. The echoes of their argument lingered in every corner of their home, a constant reminder of the betrayal that now defined their marriage. Yet, even in the midst of the turmoil, there was a faint glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption, if only they could find the strength to reach for it. On March 15th, a cloudy Friday morning, Sarah sat in her car outside Gloria's house. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and she stared at the raindrops trailing down the windshield. She had been parked there for 5 minutes, debating whether to go in. Gloria was her closest friend, a pillar of strength in her life, but this was different. This was about David, about their marriage, and about the secret she could no longer bear alone. Finally, Sarah gathered the courage, wiped her tear-streaked face, and knocked on the door. Gloria opened it with her usual warmth, her smile fading the moment she saw Sarah's swollen eyes. Without a word, she pulled Sarah into a tight hug and led her inside. The two women sat on Gloria's couch, a steaming cup of tea in each of their hands. The sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the silence between them. "It's David," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. He's been unfaithful." Gloria's eyes widened, and she leaned closer, gently placing her hand on Sarah's arm. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry. What happened?" Sarah's words spilled out like a flood, recounting everything. The emails, the confrontation, the night spent crying alone in her room. By the time she finished, her voice was hoarse, and her hands trembled. Gloria sat quietly, letting her friend pour out her pain. When Sarah finally fell silent, Gloria took a deep breath. "Sarah, you need to talk to someone. A counselor, maybe a pastor you trust. You can't carry this on your own." "I don't know if I can," Sarah admitted. "What if people find out? What if they judge me? Or worse, what if they blame me?" Gloria shook her head firmly. "Sarah, you've done nothing wrong. David made the choice to betray your trust, and he needs to be held accountable. But you don't have to face this alone." Gloria hesitated before continuing. "I've been where you are, Sarah. Years ago, before you and I became close, my marriage nearly fell apart. My husband. He wasn't faithful either." Sarah stared at her friend in shock. Gloria had always seemed so composed, her marriage so solid. "I had no idea," Sarah whispered. "I never told anyone," Gloria said, her voice soft but steady. "It was the hardest time of my life. But through counseling, prayer, and a lot of painful honesty, we found a way to rebuild. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it." For the first time in days, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. If Gloria could survive this, maybe she could too. 5 days later, on the evening of March 20th, David sat in the church's small meeting room, facing the elders. The room was dimly lit, and the air was thick with tension. David had requested the meeting himself, knowing he couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer. His hands shook as he gripped the edges of his chair. The head elder, a stern but compassionate man named Robert, leaned forward. "David, we're here to listen, but we need you to be completely honest." David nodded, his throat dry. He took a deep breath and began. He spoke of the emails, the inappropriate relationship with Melissa, and the pain he had caused Sarah. His voice cracked several times, but he pushed through, laying bare every shameful detail. When he finished, the room fell silent. The elders exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disappointment and sorrow. "I can't express how sorry I am," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've failed as a husband, a father, and a pastor. I'm willing to step down if that's what you decide." Robert cleared his throat, his face grim. "David, this is a serious matter. You've broken trust, not just with your wife, but with this congregation. We need to pray and discuss this as a group before making any decisions." The debate that followed was heated. Some elders argued that David should resign immediately, while others believed in offering him a chance at restoration. After nearly 2 hours, they reached a decision. David would take a month-long leave from his pastoral duties to seek spiritual and marital restoration. During this time, he would be required to meet regularly with a counselor and remain completely transparent with the church leadership. David accepted their decision with humility, though the weight of his actions bore heavily on him. As he left the meeting room that night, the church's empty hallways felt colder than ever. By March 25th, Sarah found herself turning to the Bible for answers. She spent hours each day reading and rereading familiar stories, searching for some semblance of peace. One evening, as she sat in bed with her Bible open on her lap, she came across the story of Jesus carrying the cross. The words struck her in a way they never had before. Despite betrayal, rejection, and unimaginable pain, he kept going, she murmured to herself. Tears streamed down her face as she imagined the weight of the cross and the burden of sin Jesus bore for humanity. In that moment, Sarah felt a flicker of strength. If Jesus could endure such suffering out of love, perhaps she could find the strength to endure her own pain. She didn't know what the future held, but she resolved to take things one day at a time. By March 30th, the Grayson family's troubles had become the talk of the neighborhood. Rumors about David's affair spread like wildfire, fueled by whispers at church and on social media. Reporters began showing up outside their home, hoping to catch a glimpse of the disgraced pastor. Inside the house, the tension was palpable. Ethan, their 16-year-old son, slammed his backpack onto the floor after school. "They're calling you a fraud, Dad," he shouted. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" David tried to reach out, but Ethan stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. Grace, their 14-year-old daughter, sat silently at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She had been unusually quiet lately, avoiding her friends and skipping after-school activities. Sarah watched her children, her heart breaking for them. She felt powerless, caught between her own pain and their growing resentment. That night, as the family sat down for a strained dinner, the sound of a news report about David's affair blared from the living room TV. Sarah turned it off, her hands trembling. "We're going to get through this," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. David nodded, but his eyes were filled with guilt. The cracks in their family were widening, and the path to healing seemed impossibly far away. This chapter of their story was marked by heartbreak and conflict, but it also planted the seeds of resilience. Each member of the Grayson family would have to confront their pain, their fears, and their faith as they navigated the fallout of David's betrayal. On the morning of April 5th, David hesitated outside the counselor's office. The small brass plaque on the door read Dr. Evelyn Carter, licensed therapist. His palms were sweaty, and he adjusted his tie nervously, though the gesture felt pointless in such a casual setting. He had spent the drive rehearsing what to say but now felt like a deer caught in headlights. "Pastor Grayson?" called a soft voice. David turned to see Dr. Carter, a kind-faced woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through him. She gestured for him to come inside. The room was warm and inviting, filled with bookshelves and soft chairs. David sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly. He struggled to meet Dr. Carter's gaze as she began the session. "So, David," she said gently, "what brought you here today?" He let out a shaky breath. "I've made mistakes. Big ones. I've hurt my wife, my family, my church. I'm here because I don't want to keep hurting the people I love." As the session went on, David began to open up about his struggles. His pride, his constant need for validation, and the emptiness he felt despite his successes. "I preach about grace and humility every week," he admitted, his voice heavy with shame. "But I think, deep down, I've been chasing something else. Recognition, maybe. Approval. I don't know how to stop needing it. Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. Do you think this need for approval started recently, or is it something you've carried for a long time? The question hit David like a freight train. Memories he had buried long ago began to resurface. When I was a kid, he began slowly, I never felt enough. My father was strict, distant really. He believed in discipline more than affection. And my mom, well, she tried, but she was overwhelmed raising 4 boys. I was just invisible. Tears welled in his eyes as he continued. I guess I learned early on that being good wasn't enough. I had to be better. Smarter, stronger, more successful. I thought if I could achieve enough, maybe someone would notice me. Dr. Carter leaned forward. And did anyone notice? David shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. Not really. And when they did, it was never for long. The session ended with David feeling both lighter and heavier. He had finally started to face the wounds he'd carried for decades, but the journey to healing felt overwhelming. 5 days later, on April 10th, the church held a prayer vigil for the Grayson family. The sanctuary was dimly lit, candles flickering softly in the hands of the attendees. People filled the pews, their voices lifting in hymns that echoed off the walls. Sarah sat in the front row with Ethan and Grace, both of whom were visibly uncomfortable. Ethan kept his head down, fidgeting with his phone, while Grace sat stiffly, her arms crossed. Sarah's heart ached for her children, who were bearing the weight of something they hadn't caused. David stood at the back of the church, away from the pulpit he had once commanded with confidence. He felt out of place, like a stranger in the house of God. As the prayers began, David overheard snippets of conversations around him. Do you think he'll ever come back as pastor? Honestly, I'm not sure he should. It's not just about him. It's about the family. They need our support. The word stung, but David knew they weren't entirely wrong. He had betrayed their trust, and earning it back would take time, if it was even possible. That evening, David returned home feeling small. He knew he needed to do more than just pray. He needed to act. The next morning, he visited the local homeless shelter, a place he had driven past countless times but never thought to enter. The shelter director, a cheerful woman named Marie, greeted him warmly. What brings you here, Pastor? David shifted uncomfortably. I'd like to help. Voluntarily. But I'd prefer to stay anonymous. Marie gave him a knowing smile. We can always use extra hands. There's no shortage of work to be done. Over the next few weeks, David scrubbed floors, served meals, and listened to the stories of people who had lost everything. He worked silently, finding solace in the simplicity of the tasks. For the first time in years, he wasn't standing on a stage or trying to prove himself. He was just helping. On April 15th, Sarah received an email from the Regional Women's Ministry. They were hosting a conference on forgiveness and wanted her to speak. She stared at the screen for a long time, her emotions warring within her. Forgiveness. The word felt heavy, almost mocking. How could she speak about something she was still struggling to understand? That evening, she mentioned the invitation to Gloria. Are you going to do it? Gloria asked. I don't know, Sarah admitted. How can I stand up there and talk about forgiveness when I'm still so angry? Gloria placed a hand on her shoulder. Maybe that's exactly why you should do it. You don't have to have all the answers, Sarah. Sometimes sharing the struggle is enough. After much prayer and hesitation, Sarah decided to accept. On the day of the conference, she stood backstage, clutching the edges of her notes. Her heart pounded as the host introduced her. When she stepped onto the stage, a sea of faces stared back at her. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. Forgiveness is messy, she began, her voice wavering. It's not a single moment or a simple choice. It's a journey. A painful, humbling journey. She shared her story with raw honesty, admitting her anger, her hurt, and her doubts. She spoke about the nights she cried out to God, begging for answers, and the moments when she wanted to give up. But, she concluded, her voice steady now, forgiveness isn't just about freeing the other person. It's about freeing yourself. It's about letting go of the chains that anger and pain wrap around your heart. The room was silent for a moment before erupting into applause. As Sarah stepped off the stage, several women approached her, sharing their own stories of betrayal and brokenness. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone. That evening, she returned home feeling a small but significant shift in her heart. Forgiveness was still a work in progress, but she was beginning to see its power, not just for David, but for herself. On April 20th, Sarah stood backstage at a community auditorium, her palms sweaty and her heart racing. The audience was buzzing with anticipation. The room was filled with women from all walks of life, eager to hear her speak. The theme of the event, Hope Beyond Pain, felt both fitting and ironic. Sarah, still raw from her wounds, didn't feel like a beacon of hope. The host's voice echoed over the microphone, introducing her with warm enthusiasm. Please welcome Sarah Grayson, a woman whose story reminds us of the power of faith and resilience. The applause was thunderous, but Sarah's knees felt weak. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the spotlight. The faces of the audience blurred for a moment, and she gripped the podium to steady herself. "Good morning," she began, her voice trembling. "When I was asked to speak about hope, I almost said no. Because if I'm being honest, hope hasn't been easy for me to hold on to lately." The room fell silent, the weight of her words drawing everyone in. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. She shared her story of betrayal, the discovery of David's affair, the heartbreak, the anger, and the countless nights spent questioning her faith. She described the crushing pain of trying to hold her family together while her own heart was breaking. But then she shifted her focus, her voice softening. "In the midst of my darkest moments, I found myself returning to one story in the Bible. The story of Jesus carrying the cross. Betrayed, abandoned, rejected. And yet, he kept going. He carried the weight of the world's sins, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He chose love, even when it hurt." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but she didn't wipe them away. She let the audience see her vulnerability, her brokenness. "I realized that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about choosing love, even when it feels impossible. It's about trusting God to heal what we can't." The room was silent, save for the quiet sniffles of women moved by her words. When Sarah finished, the applause was deafening. As she stepped off the stage, several women approached her, sharing their own stories of pain and resilience. Yet, despite the impact of her speech, Sarah couldn't shake the heaviness in her heart. At home, her children remained distant. Ethan barely spoke to her, retreating to his room after school. Grace, once so bubbly and outgoing, seemed consumed by anxiety. And David? David felt like a ghost in their home, his presence marked more by guilt than anything else. 5 days later, on April 25th, Sarah was cleaning the kitchen when the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find Melissa standing there, her face pale and her eyes downcast. Sarah's heart clenched. "Mrs. Grayson," Melissa began, her voice shaking. "I needed to see you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to apologize." Sarah stiffened, her grip tightening on the door. "Why now?" she asked, her tone sharp. Melissa looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Because I've been carrying this guilt, and it's eating me alive. What I did was wrong, so wrong. I ruined your trust, your family. I'm sorry. Truly." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Sarah wanted to slam the door, to tell Melissa that her apology didn't matter. But something held her back. "Do you know what you've done to my family?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Do you know how much pain you caused?" Melissa nodded, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I do. And I'm so sorry." The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken pain. Finally, Sarah stepped back, motioning for Melissa to come inside. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Sarah had cried countless nights over her broken marriage. After a long silence, Sarah spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not fully, not yet. But I can pray for you." Melissa looked up, surprised. Sarah reached across the table, taking Melissa's trembling hands in hers. Together they prayed. Sarah's words faltering but heartfelt, Melissa's sobs filling the spaces between. When Melissa left that day, Sarah felt a strange sense of release, as though a weight she didn't know she was carrying had been lifted. By April 30th, David knew he couldn't avoid the inevitable any longer. That Sunday, he stood before the congregation, the same congregation that had once admired him so deeply. The church was packed, the pews filled with familiar faces, some supportive, others skeptical. David took a deep breath. gripping the edges of the pulpit. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I've stood here many times, preaching about grace, redemption, and the love of God. But today, I stand before you as a broken man. A man who has fallen short in ways I never imagined." He paused, the weight of his words settling over the room. "I've betrayed my wife, my family, and the trust of this church. For that, I am deeply sorry. I take full responsibility for my actions, and I ask for your forgiveness. Not because I deserve it, but because I believe in the power of grace." The silence was deafening. Some people bowed their heads in prayer, while others exchanged whispered comments. "I will be stepping down as your pastor," David continued, his voice breaking. "I need time to seek God's healing and to rebuild my family. I hope in time, you can find it in your hearts to forgive me." As he stepped down from the pulpit, the congregation erupted into mixed reactions. Some stood, clapping slowly in a show of support. Others remained seated, their faces etched with disappointment. In the back of the church, Sarah watched quietly, her emotions a whirlwind of sadness and relief. This was a turning point, not just for David, but for their family. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, they were facing it together. This chapter of their journey was marked by raw vulnerability and painful honesty. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance to lay bare their wounds and begin the slow, difficult process of healing. On the morning of May 10th, Sarah and David packed an overnight bag and drove 2 hours to a secluded retreat center nestled in the hills. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and fresh earth, but neither of them noticed. The silence in the car was heavy, each lost in their thoughts. The retreat, organized by a Christian marriage ministry, was their first step toward repairing what had been shattered. When they arrived, they were greeted by a soft-spoken couple, Mark and Ellen, who led the retreat. Their warmth and understanding immediately put Sarah at ease, though David's shoulders remained tense. They were shown to a modest cabin, its walls adorned with scripture verses about love and forgiveness. That evening, the group gathered around a crackling fire, sharing stories of pain and reconciliation. Sarah listened intently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. David spoke only when prompted, his words clipped and cautious. The next day, the real work began. Mark led them through a series of exercises designed to rebuild trust. One activity required each person to list 3 things they regretted about their actions. David hesitated, his pen hovering over the paper. "I regret betraying you," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "I regret putting my pride above our family. And I regret not seeing how much you were hurting." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. For the first time, she felt that David truly understood the depth of her pain. Later that afternoon, they were asked to share what they appreciated most about each other. Sarah glanced at David, her expression softening. "I appreciate how you're trying, even when it's hard," she said. "And I appreciate the way you love our kids." David looked down, his voice cracking as he replied, "I appreciate your strength. Even when I gave you every reason to leave, you stayed." The days were filled with difficult conversations, moments of silence, and small breakthroughs. Progress was slow, but it was there, a faint but steady light piercing through the darkness. By May 20th, life at home was still tense. Ethan, their 16-year-old son, had grown increasingly distant, his resentment bubbling just below the surface. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Ethan suddenly slammed his fork down. "Why are we pretending everything's okay?" he snapped, glaring at David. "You ruined everything, and now we're supposed to just act like it didn't happen?" David's face fell, his hands trembling slightly. "Ethan, I know I hurt you," he began, his voice heavy with guilt. "No, you don't," Ethan shouted, standing up so abruptly his chair nearly tipped over. "You don't know what it's like to hear people whispering about us at school. To watch Mom cry every night while you preach about forgiveness like nothing happened." The room went silent except for the sound of Grace's quiet sobs. David stood slowly, his eyes locked on his son. "You're right," he said softly. "I don't know what that's like. But I know I failed you. And I'm so sorry." Ethan's fists clenched, his face flushed with anger. For a moment, it seemed he might storm out of the room. But instead he stayed, his voice breaking as he said, "I just don't know if I can trust you again." David stepped closer, his own tears falling freely now. "You don't have to trust me right away, Ethan. I'll earn it back, no matter how long it takes." Then, to everyone's surprise, Ethan hugged his father tightly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. On May 25th, Sarah found a small folded note on her pillow. The handwriting was familiar. Grace's neat, careful script. "I see how hard you're trying, Mom. I love you." Sarah pressed the note to her chest, tears spilling down her cheeks. Grace had been so withdrawn lately, her anxiety casting a shadow over everything. This small gesture felt like a lifeline, a reminder that even the smallest steps mattered. By June 15th, the Grayson family gathered in the backyard of a close friend's home. The sun was shining, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. It was the day Sarah and David had decided to renew their vows, a quiet, intimate ceremony attended only by family and a few close friends. Sarah wore a simple white dress, her hair swept back in soft curls. David stood beside her, looking both nervous and deeply grateful. As they exchanged vows, their voices trembled with emotion. "I choose you again," David said, his voice breaking. "Not because I'm perfect, but because I'm committed to becoming the husband you deserve." Sarah took his hands, her eyes glistening with tears. "And I choose you again," she replied. "Not because it's easy, but because I believe in what God can do through us." Their friends and family clapped, some wiping away tears of their own. For the first time in months, the Graysons felt like a family again. By June 30th, David had begun working on a new book. He sat at his desk late into the night, the words flowing from his heart onto the page. The title, "The Shadow of the Cross," reflected their journey, one of pain, redemption, and hope. "This isn't just my story," David told Sarah one evening as they sipped tea together. "It's ours. It's God's." On July 10th, the Grayson family was spotted volunteering together at the local shelter. David served meals with a quiet humility, while Sarah chatted warmly with the guests. Ethan and Grace helped set up tables, their laughter ringing out as they worked. Marie, the shelter director, watched them with a smile. "You've come a long way," she said to David. "We still have a long way to go," he replied, glancing at his family with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "But we're getting there." In the weeks that followed, a new pastor was appointed at Grace Life Church. The congregation, though still healing, found hope in David's transparency and humility. His mistakes had become a cautionary tale, but also a testament to the power of God's grace. The Graysons continued their journey, proving that redemption isn't a single moment but a series of choices, daily acts of love, faith, and forgiveness.